All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the ReStory US Learning Core. We're going to dive right in today because you've got a great guest with us, and I want to maximize the amount of time we can pick his brain and ask questions and get some really good insights. So we're going to dive right in. Our guest for today for this second session on mass incarceration is Will Snowden. Will is the director of the Vera Institute of Justice's New Orleans office, and he continues and strengthens Vera's existing partnerships with criminal justice actors and community leaders while identifying new collaborative relationships with government entities and community organizations. His work is focused on improving criminal justice systems in the South, and prior to joining Vera, he was a public defender for 5 years, representing New Orleanians in all stages of a case from arraignment to trial. Will also has developed a focused and specialization in advocacy around reforming these procedures, systems, and policies around jury duty to promote diversity and representation in the jury box. I'm hoping Will tell us a lot more about all of these various facets of his work, but before I hand the mic over to Will, want to just remind us why we're here having this conversation and give a very, very brief recap over our last conversation. So last time, Mass Incarceration Session 1, we talked a little bit about the through lines from slavery to convict leasing to mass incarceration today. Why are we focusing on this for 2 or more sessions in our ReStory programming? It's because even though the US has less than 5% of the world's population, we have more than 16% of all incarcerated people, over 2 million. And there are incredible racial disparities, economic disparities within this system. It affects not only individuals, but families and communities, and will tie into every other issue that we engaged in our time together as this ReStory US Learning Core. So this is a really important kind of foundation for us to understand as we move forward into all of these other topics and engage this. We're especially paying attention to themes of cultural violence as a through line from mass incarceration, session 1, slavery, convict leasing, to mass incarceration as we understand it today. So Will, thanks so much for joining us and welcome. We're really grateful for you to take an hour out of your day doing all of this really important work to come teach us about it.
Thanks for having me.
I'd love to start by just inviting you to give us an overview of the work you do around the criminal legal system and especially ending mass incarceration. I know you do a lot, so just want to start by having you tell us a little bit about this different work you do and especially the parts you think are most relevant for us in this conversation.
Great. So the Vera Institute of Justice is a national organization that was founded in 1961 in New York. And then when it was founded, its primary focus was on the issue of money bail. Since 1961, we have expanded to do work in 43 states across the country. We have offices in New York, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, and Los Angeles. And the work that I lead is specifically for the Louisiana office. And right now we have some strategic priorities that are kind of wrapping up as we close our fiscal year, which ends at the end of June. The things that we've been working on include advancing prosecution reform in New Orleans. We elected a new district attorney in 2020 and have been providing technical assistance to him and his staff in terms of taking the policies that he ran on during his campaign and trying to translate that to actual practices in the courtroom. We are also involved in opposing the expansion of our New Orleans jail. Specifically, there are efforts trying to build a jail for people with mental illness, and we strongly believe that people with mental illness belong in a hospital and not in a jail. So we're still actively opposing that expansion. And quite frankly, we've been opposing jail expansion in New Orleans since we first came here in 2006. Another area of work that we have, we call investing in thriving communities. So as we are navigating conversations of public safety, we want to uplift the reality that when we invest in communities and we enable them to actually thrive, that is actually a tactic to promote public safety. And the last thing on is created a slide data which allows you to look at all 64 parishes. We say parish instead of county, but it's the same thing. And you can pull up incarceration data about those parishes. You can understand how many people are actually in the jail, what are the demographics of the jail compared to the demographics of the parish. You can also get a look at the investments that are being made in the criminal legal system actors, so the courts, the judges, the prosecutors, the police, as well as how much money are we spending on education, hospitals, other non-criminal legal system elements. And it's a really unique tool, allows us really get an understanding of who are the hotspot parishes throughout the state of Louisiana. And what that will allow us to do is do some work in those jurisdictions to try to replicate some of the safe jail population reduction that we've been able to achieve in New Orleans over the last 16 years.
It's an incredible overview and amount of work you all are doing. And I hope we have a chance to unpack each of the initiatives that you mentioned. And for the Learning Core members on this call, we'll hopefully have some time at the end for you to ask questions. So start thinking about what you want to follow up with Will about as well. I want to go back to what you started with, talking about Vera's origin and bail reform. Can you share a little bit more about money bail and its impact on communities, as well as the need for reform?
Sure. So historically speaking, the twin aims of money bail were to promote public safety and to ensure somebody comes back to court if they are released. And what we have seen is money is actually a tool that does not ensure either of those things. And so I make the statement that money bail does not keep us safe because it does not address any of the elements that a person may have that could potentially pose a threat to our communities. So just kind of a quick summary and a reminder of how money bail works. Let's say somebody is arrested, and usually within 24 or 48 hours, they have to have a bail hearing. In Louisiana, we call them first appearances. At a first appearance, essentially three things happen, and these three things are pretty universal across the country. One, the judge is going to determine if there is probable cause for your arrest. Two, the judge is going to determine whether or not you are eligible for a public defender. And then three, the judge is going to set a bail amount on you. Now, the way that the math kind of works is if somebody gets a $10,000 bail assigned to them, they would typically go to a commercial bail bondsman and pay a 12% fee. So they pay $1,200 to the bail bondsman. The bail bondsman then goes to the court and they sign a promissory note saying that they will be on the hook if Will Snowden doesn't show up. They'll be on the hook for $10,000. And let's say I go to court, I get a new court date, I go to court, my next hearing, I get a new court date, I go to court, and it's my trial date and I'm found not guilty. Let's say my parents are the ones that put that $1,200 back, $1,200 up. They never received that $1,200 back, even if I'm found not guilty at trial. Or let's say halfway through the case, the district attorney decides to dismiss all of the charges. My parents don't get that $1,200 back. And so the reason why I say money bail doesn't necessarily keep us safe is because we lose the incentive to ensure people are showing up to court because the money is never returned after we have kind of commercialized the bail system. And then secondly, if I pose a threat to the community and I have access to wealth, I can post my bond, and that's going to do nothing to mitigate the threat that I might pose to our communities. And so we really want to be thinking about how are we changing the tools that we are using to determine who's detained pretrial and who is not. Because I strongly believe that the coins in your pocket should not be the keys to the jail. And with our current money bail system across the country, what ends up happening is poor people who do not necessarily pose a threat to our communities are stuck in jail because they don't have access to wealth, while people who might pose threat to our communities and do have money are able to get out. And so we need to be rethinking what we want to use as the determining factors of deciding who should be detained pretrial and who should not, because the effect that it is having is disproportionately impacting poor people and disproportionately not providing public safety.
It's a really helpful overview. It's bringing to mind, we've talked about this a little bit before, and we'll pick up on it in future sessions, the idea of the criminalization of poverty, and how poverty intersects with all of this. And I don't want to draw unhelpful parallels, but I do want to call back to what we talked about in our last session with debt peonage, that this is again a way of having a system that doesn't serve people, that is extracting, especially from folks who don't have material resources. Are there any initiatives out there that you think we should be aware of, or could give us just, an insight into for our own further research about proposed alternatives or some of the advocacy around bail reform for what alternative systems could look like?
Vera introduced a different model in 2019, and I'll try to look it up while we're talking. We had a proposal of how to really replace money bail with a different approach. And we created this blueprint in terms of what the judges could utilize. And our approach essentially was, if you are charged with a crime of violence, then you should be, you should have a detention hearing. If you're not charged with a crime of violence, you should be released. So the very first step is really deciding who we should be having conversations about detention or release solely based on the criminal code as it relates to a crime of violence. Now, just because you are charged with a crime of violence doesn't necessarily mean that you should be detained. So after you have the hearing, or at the hearing, the prosecutor will put up, their evidence, their demonstration, their proof that this person should be detained pre-trial and should not be released. And then the defense can kind of contest that, those representations. And so I think when we talk about a different model, first, we want to change the categories of who's eligible to be considered for a bail setting in the first place. And then from there, change the actual bail hearing, where there has to be an assessment of, does this person pose a threat to our community? And is there anything that could be put in place to mitigate those threats? And if there isn't anything that can be put in place, then the person should be detained. And we really want to remove money from the equation, because it doesn't do anything to mitigate any of the threat. What Vera has also done is we've created an ability to pay calculator. So oftentimes jurisdictions will have judges that set bail amounts solely based on the charge. So let's say I'm charged with armed robbery with a firearm, and the allegation is that I committed an armed robbery with a firearm on April 20th at 9 a.m. Central Time. And, somebody says that I robbed them at the corner of Tulane and Carrollton. And they go to a detective. They say, Will Snowden has a beard, light-skinned black guy, robbed me at this intersection. Then the detective goes to the court. The court will sign that warrant, and they can come and arrest me. The judge sees that I'm charged with armed robbery with a firearm, and they set a $50,000 bail amount simply because it's a serious charge. But we all know I was actually on the Zoom and it's recorded, so I have a great alibi that demonstrates I did not commit that crime. But simply because the seriousness of the offense, creating a very high amount, even though the evidence is really, really weak, because there's not going to be any video of me committing that crime. So I say all that to say is that Vera has produced this ability to pay calculator, because let's say I don't work at Vera. Let's say that I work at Dini's Seafood, and that I am a dishwasher, and that my salary is $12 an hour. And the exact same facts, you set a $50,000 bail on me. I'm never going to be able to meet that. My parents are going to be able to come up with the 12% to pay the bail bondsman. And so I'm going to sit in jail. But what this ability to pay calculator does is it would look at my income. It will look at my bank statements. It would look at a variety of kind of assets that I have, to kind of algorithmically bring together a number that demonstrates how much bail I could actually meet. Because remember, with bail, what a judge is saying is, I want this person to be released, but I want them to be released for $50,000, for $10,000, whatever it is. And so this ability to pay calculator actually incorporates a person's assets and their wealth to give more insight into what they actually could afford. So I think that's a good model as well. And then you have jurisdictions like the federal government that really are just kind of on a detain or not detain approach. And we're in an interesting space in bail reform, because the detain not detain approach sometimes actually detain people, and approach that actually utilizes bail. So it's something we're still figuring out and something that we're still working on. But our position is we need to replace the tool of money, because it isn't an effective one to determine who should be detained pre-trial or not.
I'll go on Vera's website and I can pull those links out and share them in the follow-up email with this recording. The other thing that comes to mind for me, Will, as you're sharing that hypothetical anecdote, is if someone can't afford to meet bail and they're sitting in jail, even if they've got the alibi of the Zoom link, they're missing income while they're, incarcerated. They might lose their house because they can't pay rent because they don't have money. There might be, childcare issues that come. So there's all of these other implications that come, even if someone has evidence and is innocent, because they just can't afford to post that bail. So that's just
Hmm.
another piece I wanted to pull out. One of the other,
Yeah, I think.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just think I think, and I was reading Tom Grant's comment in the chat. The fact that people are stuck in jail because they don't have money is not what we want our jails to be utilized for, right? We think about jails as being institutions that detain people and remove them from our communities because they're posing some type of threat to the community. But if you are poor and you're not charged with an offense that indicates that you're being accused of some type of crime that poses a threat to our community, then why are we using jails to detain those folks? And the fact that we have hundreds of thousands across our country that are in jail solely because they're poor should be an indicator that we need to reevaluate the system of bail and pretrial detention altogether.
Absolutely. I want to shift a little bit. This is a question that came up in our last session that we wanted to use your expertise around as well, talking about incentives and money and the criminal legal system. Can you talk a little bit about the role for-profit prisons play in mass incarceration, especially the incentives or disincentives they give to a variety of actors that, like, what came up for us was this seemingly on the surface, right, directly contravenes the justice work that we think needs to be done. So what are they? What role do they play in the system?
Mm-hmm.
And why are they such a problem when it comes to incentivizing any of these reforms?
Yeah, I would say there's three, I guess, kind of, well, there's more than three, but three that are on my radar of private prisons operators include the GEO Group, CCA, which stands for Corrections Corporation of America, and I think the third one is the LaSalle Group. Um, what these private prisons are doing is they are removing opportunities for people to take classes or learn a trade or um, do things that we as a community would think would reduce a person's recidivism rate. And so let me just kind of give you two examples. In a regular Department of Corrections prison, and sorry, let me just back up just for a terminology reminder. There's a difference between jail and prison. A jail is a facility where people are detained pre-trial. They have not had their day in court. They have not been found guilty or pled guilty. A prison is where people are serving their sentence, so they have been found guilty. And so we have these Department of Corrections, State Department of Corrections across the country. And at those prisons, you typically, an incarcerated person would have access to earning certificates. They could potentially earn their GED if they don't have one, although I don't think it's called GED anymore. What is it called? Well, in any event, high school equivalent degree. They would actually, some people have access to college courses in prison. You could learn a trade. You could, do a variety of classes that do two things. One, it obviously enriches the incarcerated person to have access to more resources and just kind of have more knowledge, understanding, so they can go out into the free world after their sentence done. Can be the idea to be a more kind of productive member of our society. The second benefit is when you complete a course, you can take like 6 months off of your sentence. And so there's an incentive for people to complete the courses because they would get released earlier. At a private prison, those classes are not offered because they want to detain the person for as long as possible. And so when a person gets sentenced to a DOC facility, let's say for 10 years, they could be paroled, depending on the state. Let's say like in Louisiana, you could get paroled after 6 years. And so you would serve 6 years in prison, and then the remaining 4, you would have a parole officer that would visit you over that time period. But let's say you get sent to a private prison, you're going to serve 10 years, what they call flat time or day for day. And the incentive for the private prisons is to be able to make money to book Department of Corrections for as many days possible. And then for the individual, all of the skills or trades that they might have DOC, they're not going to have. And actually, the best of those programs are going to be applied to the individual in the private setting. So they might have a higher likelihood of recidivating because they weren't able to take advantage of those types of programs. And then we just have to think about the perverse nature of wanting to make money off of incarcerating people. That should not be the motivation of our criminal legal system. And even on the punishment end, if we all believe in holding people accountable, accountability is one thing, but also we want to make sure people aren't committing crimes again. And so we should be invested in providing folks opportunities to learn a trade, to get a degree, to do all these things that can contribute to their less likelihood of committing a crime when they get out. And you just don't get those opportunities at private prisons.
It's really helpful. Thanks. I'm not sure if anyone will have follow-up questions about that when we get to the Q&A, but that was a question we'd had, and that was some really helpful insight. We shared the podcast you did with us on Undaunted with the group beforehand, and one of the quotes that you said on there that really struck me was, the way we see each other is the way we treat each other. And one of the things we talk about at Telos is that culture change is sometimes upstream of politics. And right, there's a multi-pronged approach to any kind of advocacy, cultural advocacy, at the same time of trying to address systems and institutions. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the cultural change that's needed, especially in the way we see and treat each other around mass incarceration, and what the opportunities or any insight you'd like to give us around the culture change that's needed, and opportunities for us to engage in cultural peace building around mass incarceration and the issues just laid out.
Certainly. United States have a practice othering, right? And when we think about creating communities, sometimes the approach to creating community is very inward facing, and it creates kind of an us versus them dynamic. And it is just kind of difficult, at least in the conversation of criminal legal system, to not acknowledge the disparities that we have across racial lines in terms of who is occupying our jails and our prisons. I'm most familiar with Louisiana data, so I'll use that as a reference point. In Orleans Parish, we have about 1,000 people in our jail. 83% of the people in the jail are Black men, when Black men represent 25% of New Orleanians, 24% of New Orleanians. So the kind of easy and lazy assumption is that Black men in New Orleans commit more crime, or that they have more criminogenic tendencies. And I say that's easy and lazy because we are so obsessed with focusing on the problem in front of us as opposed to focusing on the problem that's creating the problem in front of us. And so when I think about talking about the problems that are creating the problems in front of us, I use this analogy that I may have shared on the podcast, but I view the criminal legal system as the catch basin for the failures of other systems. So when our education system fails, or when our housing systems fail, those are driving more people to have contact with the criminal legal system. And instead of viewing an arrest as an indicator of, criminal behavior, or just like focusing on the individual messing up, I think we're using arrests indicators of system failure, because if our systems are succeeding, fewer people are going to be having contact with police in the first place. So I say that to say, when we think about the way that prisoners or incarcerated people or folks that are in our jails and prisons are seen, they're seen as people who are so different than us. And sometimes we approach perspectives of criminality, and we hear about people committing crimes, and we view the behavior through our own lenses and say, I would never do that. I would never steal somebody's car. I would never, punch somebody in the face. And it's sometimes difficult for us to try to understand, well, what would lead a person to do this? Now, there's a host and a variety of reasons, but we are kind of trained to view others' behavior in comparison to our own, and then we create that separation. And everything about the criminal legal system contributes to their dehumanization, right? I try to have a practice of referring to people incarcerated as people who are incarcerated people. We've seen a shift in the language. Like, we don't want to say convicts. We don't want to say, felons. Like Brian Stevenson talks about, you don't want to be judged for the worst thing you've ever done in your life. And so with the shift of language, calling somebody an incarcerated person, that can help shift our perception of community and kind of erode some of that us versus them nature. So language is really important. But even if you go to a jail or you go to a courthouse, you will, depending on the jurisdiction, you will see people shuffle in orange jumpsuits and in chains, right? And they're not referred to as Will Snowden, they're referred to as the defendant. Even when you go to prison, you're not referred to as Will Snowden, you're referred to as inmate 62798 or whatever your number is going to be. And so this dehumanization that the system promotes transfers into our perspective as community members. But what's really important to know is that, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's around 80% of people in our prisons return back to our communities. So if we know that that is a reality, then we should be doing everything we can to support those folks to come home to be productive members of our communities so they're not committing crime again. And so I may have drifted a little bit away from your question, but when I think about the othering that takes place within the criminal legal system and this idea of, the way we see each other is the way we treat each other, I really believe that for a variety of reasons, personal experiences, but also just perspectives of our system, is that if we can actually see somebody as our potential neighbor, right, how are we going to treat them differently? But our system doesn't promote our perspective or seeing these people as people. Our system promotes seeing these people as problems. And the solution to these quote unquote problems is by locking them up and forgetting about them. But we have to remember and embrace the reality that many of these people are coming home. And when they do come home, we want to make sure that they're productive members of our communities.
Seeing people as people and not as problems is a really impactful way of framing that. And thinking about what you were talking about with othering, I think a lot of times the root of othering is fear. And as we know, in a lot of contexts, fear and nuanced thinking don't go hand in hand. And that's something I want to kind of keep at the forefront as I ask this next question. Because right now across the US, violent crime is on the rise. And I think there's a lot of communities who are trying to wrestle with this question of what does it mean to be committed to some of this reform, like cultural peace building around these assumptions, as they address the fact that violent crime is increasing in communities. And there's a lot of, I think, fear. And yeah, fear is rooted in othering. And it kind of is that cyclical question of how do we engage our communities in these conversations, recognizing that there are real concerns, and that doesn't oppose everything we've talked about with the need for reform. But as we go back out into our communities and try and step into this conversation and bring some nuance, how would you help us have these conversations advocating for safe communities for everyone, folks who have been incarcerated, are incarcerated, have never been incarcerated?
You hit it on the head. We are experiencing a rise in crimes of violence across the country. And what's frustrating for me to hear as somebody who works in the space of trying to change our criminal legal system and actually create a criminal justice system that is worthy of its name, people are blaming past reforms on the increase in violent crime. But we know that that's simply not true, because there are jurisdictions that have not had any criminal justice reform in the last 10 years, and they are experiencing the exact same uptick in violent crime. And so we know that the common denominator is not reform. One common denominator is the influence of the pandemic. And when I speak with my colleagues at Vera, that's something that we typically talk about, that the pandemic has had a different effect on people's behaviors. I personally am not satisfied with that explanation. I think it's a starting point, but I think we have to take it probably about 5 steps further. But as we think about people's frustration, which I think is appropriate and valid, I want people to take that frustration with the crime that is, prevalent around us and transfer it to what our solutions are going to be. I am tired of hearing my council members and even my neighbors and community members say this has to stop. I agree with that 100%. The increase in violent crime has to stop. We also have to stop relying on old tactics that never actually worked to address violent crime in the first place. So that leads us to the conversation of policing. We have to remember that police actually, root to crime, necessarily prevent crime, just in terms of how they are positioned in our communities. And so what I want us to do is really make sure we are deploying police in the most effective way, and that we are also supplementing the work of police, because it's not fair to overly rely on police to do the 1,000 things that they get called to do. So what that means for me is, if we think about, and again, I think I've used this analogy before, if we think about public safety as a two-sided coin, on one side we have prevention, on the other side we have accountability. We know what's on the accountability side. It's policing, prosecution, prisons, things like that. On the prevention side, I think we have to get really creative in terms of what are the types of investments and supports and programs and services that need to be provided to prevent crime in the first place. Because if we can make those investments, right, those are going to have the benefits of not over relying on our police and on our prisons and our prosecutions to promote public safety. Louisiana has had the highest incarceration rate in the country for decades. And we are a test case that incarceration alone does not actually provide public safety. And so I'm really just tired and frustrated with conversations of having more police or harsher prosecution as a response to violent crime, because it simply has not worked in the past and it is not going to work now. Now, I do believe in holding people accountable, but we have to think differently in terms of what accountability can look like, because we can be incorporating practices of restorative justice into conversations of accountability. We don't have to solely rely on locking a person up to hold a person accountable. And additionally, we have to be more creative in terms of the things that we need to be providing that can actually prevent crime in the first place. So as listeners are thinking about what can they be doing in their home communities, I don't want to invalidate anybody's frustrations. I think we all should be frustrated with the rise of crime. We all deserve to live in safe communities. And we also have to understand that safety and justice actually can coexist. Unfortunately, what is happening is people attacking reforms that are rooted in justice, and then trying to say, if we do these reforms, then we're not going to have safety. And that's just simply not the case. And so as folks are thinking about what can they do in their home communities, and they're having conversations about providing public safety, if we have this two-sided coin, what we need is a parity of investment. So whenever you hear your mayor or your city council members or whomever talking about increasing the budget for policing, let's say they want to add $20 million, sure, go ahead and do that. But also add $20 million on the preventative side. We have to continue our sole on police who are positioned to prevent crime to create safe communities. And I know having conversations about policing can sometimes be a hot topic, right? I think with some of the analysis that the Vera Institute has done, we've looked at what we call 911 calls for service. So really getting an understanding of what New Orleanians are calling 911 for. And our analysis from 2021 looked at a little more than 300,000 calls. And what we realized, or what the data informed us of, is that 70% of those calls were for what are categorized as public order maintenance. So what that means, it's like public drunkenness or a traffic stop or a mental health crisis or a drug overdose. So not actual incidents of violence. And then there are about 25% of the calls actually were for incidents of violence. So I want us to imagine a world where we are deploying police to those 25% of calls of incidents of violence. And then we're using other teams that don't have to be law enforcement to respond to those other calls. So if somebody is experiencing a mental health crisis and they do not pose a threat to the community around them, so just as an example, you can be experiencing a mental health crisis and waving a knife around, right? I would say it would be appropriate for a police officer who's trained in responding to people, with knives or guns, to just kind of, for lack of a better term, secure the scene, right? Disarm that person and then deploy the team that can actually help diagnose and treat and get that person to the services that they need. And so that's called a co-responder model. And there's some models of that around the country. So, responding to mental health crises differently, responding to drug overdoses differently, and really thinking through what are the appropriate teams to respond to the specific, issues that are being raised from the 911 calls, so that police officers can focus on the things that they are actually trained to respond to, but also so that we can deploy the experts to address these underlying issues that might be fueling contact with police in the first place.
That's super helpful. I'm wondering if you can take some of what you just laid out over the past, half an hour plus, and help us disseminate it into a set of questions that we could raise with our communities. I think I can only speak for myself, but sometimes when folks engage in these conversations, especially when you meet challenger resistance, people are like, well, if you're not an expert in everything, then right, you clearly don't have the solutions thought through. Where for most of us, we're still learning deeply about all of this, even as we want to start advocating. Is there a way of helping us frame like a question toolkit or a couple questions that we can bring back to our communities to help shape this conversation away from one of fear and punishment and othering towards one that is more oriented in a care of community and right, seeing folks who've experienced the criminal legal system as our neighbors, that we can use to help further these conversations without being put in the position of having to be experts in order to be taken seriously when we raise these concerns.
I think the questions would be framed around this idea of validating assumptions. So, say somebody is arrested for carjacking, and the first question, maybe it's just all why questions, right? So, like, why did this person commit this carjacking? And the answers might be, the assumptions might be, oh, this is a bad person. Well, why are they a bad person, right? Well, maybe because they didn't have this in their household. Why did they have this in their house? Like, really trying to understand a bigger picture. And I think if we understand a bigger picture, we actually can reveal bigger solutions. Because when we are just focusing on the individual, then the solution is just hold that individual accountable, punish that individual, as opposed to thinking about what does accountability for a system look like, or what does change within a system look like. So I think we should be, I guess the types of questions we should be asking is really validating the assumptions that we are making. So why were the police the best team to respond to this type of a call? Or why was charging this kid as an adult and sentencing him to prison why is the thing that our system can do? Or just what's another example? Setting bail, for $50,000 on this person that doesn't have any prior criminal history and the evidence doesn't sound as strong. Why is that the appropriate thing to do? So I think interrogating the practices of our system in a way that is yearning for more understanding, because what I found is people who don't work within the criminal legal system or don't have contact with the criminal legal system, either from a personal experience or from a family member or a friend, we kind of sometimes just blindly trust that it is working. But when we actually pop the hood and we see the inner workings of the system and understanding that it's not working the way that we need it to, I think asking questions as everyday citizens to interrogate whether or not we could be doing better, I think is a good starting point.
That's a fantastic answer, and one that's helping me think through how I'm going to keep asking these questions in my community. Want to open it up to other folks on the call to ask questions, so I've just got one more for you. But we talked a little bit about like the cultural peacemaking side of things, right? How we ask these questions in our communities. What are some of the much more concrete opportunities for us to get involved today beyond just committing to combat the culture of violence that enables the system to continue? What are the concrete opportunities for us to partner with you guys in your work around ending mass incarceration?
One opportunity is nerding out on our reports. um, I've been trying to push Vera to get away from 64-page reports and really just get them down to 10. Just kind of had a shift in people's excitement or willingness to read really thorough and well-produced research reports or analyses. But I think sometimes now, I don't want to say people's attention spans are shorter, but the commitment to kind of reading longer reports has certainly waned. And so, if for anybody that kind of goes into some of our reports on our website, you will begin to see a transition that our reports are getting a little bit more short and succinct. But for the person that does want to do the deeper dive, like there's an opportunity to kind of go down that rabbit hole. So one, I guess, opportunity is to learn from some of the research that we've been able to do to give you insight into some of these issues that you care about. Vera certainly prides itself in the data and research that we were able to do. We have this understanding that you can't manage what you don't measure. And in the fourth kind of strategic priority that I named that my office is doing, as we are approaching the problem of mass incarceration in Louisiana, I had my team create this data hub because when I would go to the state capitol and I would say Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate in the world, there were representatives who just simply did not believe me. And then the second thing is they thought that Orleans Parish, where New Orleans is located, is the main contributor to Louisiana's mass incarceration problem. And the reason why they think that is because that belief is rooted in racism. Since New Orleans is a predominantly Black city, they think that's where all our crime and our imprisonment is taking place. But in actuality, Orleans Parish, our jail, I want to say we are, I think maybe we have 64 parishes. Orleans Parish is near the bottom. It's like the 50th lowest. So the top is like Bossier Parish, Caddo Parish, East Carroll Parish. And actually, let me put that that source in the chat box because it's a really cool tool.
And for all of us joining us later, I'll make sure we've got all the links that have been put in the chat shared with the recording.
So this, I just put in the chat, the data hub is called Louisiana Locked Up, a Problem in Every Parish, which is actually getting to the point that I was making, that mass incarceration in Louisiana is something that is being contributed to by all 64 parishes. So I was just talking about providing context to state legislators as it relates to what incarceration data looks in their home jurisdictions has been really valuable. And with this data hub, what you'll be able to see is you can pretty much click on any parish and get a lot of data about that individual parish. And we are able to use those parish profiles in conversations with the state representatives so they understand what some of the problems are looking like in their home jurisdictions. So use Vera as a resource. So use people who have been survivors of crime as a resource. I think sometimes they get left out of the conversation of what our criminal legal system should look like. And it's interesting, some of the parallel frustrations that they have that don't always necessarily get lifted up, but I think are an important voice in terms of what they think justice can look like. And there are a variety of organizations that dedicate themselves to work with survivors of crime and to reform the criminal legal system. So I think including them as part of the conversation is another important thing that we can be doing as well. So we have survivors of crime as well as people who have been incarcerated, lifting up and learning from their expertise and their voices is definitely something that we need to be part of, including their perspective and expertise in our conversations as well.
That's a great answer. Thanks so much for all of that context. Well, I look forward to nerding out personally on those reports on Vera's website, and I'll encourage everyone else on this call to really take some time to dive through and read. It's a great way to keep learning and getting some of the data. And I really appreciate what you said about you can't manage what you don't measure. That's really helpful. I want to open it up now in our last 15 minutes to the rest of you on this call. Any questions you have for Will about anything he's talked about, any of the work he mentioned that he hasn't talked about? The floor is yours. We're a small enough group that feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in if you've got something you'd like to ask.
Hi, Will. Hi, Sarah. This is Tom. Thanks, Will, for your work and educating us today. Two questions, I guess. The easier one might be, is the work that you're doing in Louisiana, is that replicated or able to be replicated in other states? You said you work around the country. I'm wondering, especially for data collection, because facts, while people may find them inconvenient, are a little more difficult to argue. And where I am, we're working with some programs to try and change incarceration rates and reentry into society, but having some facts would certainly help. So I'm wondering if that's replicatable somehow.
Yeah, putting another resource. I think this is the right page. Well, this will be your starting point. There is a team at Vera called, well, they used to be called In Our Backyards, which now they have a different name. But regardless, the data is there. Vera does have some resources that look at counties across the state that specifically looks at the incarceration rates, whether it's for jail, detention, or prison or imprisonment. So if you start at least in that In Our Backyards page that I just included, that'll be a good starting point for you to find a resource for your home jurisdiction. Vera approaches its work in three different ways. We have national projects, we have place-based initiatives, and then we have special projects. The way that my work is a little bit different than our national projects and our special projects is we have like permanent offices in Louisiana, California, New York, and DC. We don't have offices in those other states that we are doing work in. So the model of work is a little different, where a lot of our work is based on the relationships that we've been able to build since 2006 when we first came. Whereas the other jurisdictions, the other teams, a lot of their work is facilitated through technical assistance agreements. So you really have buy-in from the local government to say, hey, we actually want to work with Vera on these particular things. So the approach is a little bit different, and the strategic priority might be a little bit different. So we've created our strategic priorities to be responsive to the issues as we see them in Louisiana, whereas the other national initiatives might specifically work on an issue and then finds that issue in different states. So let me give you an example of two different teams. One team is called Reshaping Prosecution. It is a team that is made primarily up of former prosecutors. And what they do is they identify jurisdictions where a candidate who was run on a progressive platform, they go and they work with that progressive prosecutor to really support their administration as the new district attorney. And they do that around the country depending on election results, essentially. Another initiative is called the Initiative to End Girls' Incarceration. So girls are part of the fastest growing population of people in our jails and in our prisons. And so they are specifically identifying jurisdictions where that growth has been the fastest, and then trying to provide technical assistance in those jurisdictions. So I say that to say that the place-based teams might have 3 or 4 different strategic priorities for that year, and then it might change next year because there's different issues that we want to work on, where the national teams are very like singularly focused on an issue, and that's their expertise, and they deploy that in different jurisdictions. But I hope the In Our Backyards page, you can find, I couldn't do it in the seconds that I pulled it up, but there's like a map of the United States, and then you can really just kind of hover over any county and click on it and get some incarceration data. And I hope that your home jurisdiction is included so that you can add those facts and that data to your conversations.
Great. That's perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The other question I have, and something you mentioned earlier, you spoke about the origins of bail being partly to ensure people show up to court. I'm wondering if, because that's kind of a hot topic that several of us are trying to work on here in Northern Indiana, or it's a passion of ours anyway. Mm-hmm. Has it evolved similar to the industrialized prison complex that you mentioned, more into a budget item locally? Or does that bail process really just support the commercial bail companies? In other words, are local governments almost encouraging the bail because that goes into a line item for budget for other things?
I have not seen that direct correlation between bail fee, like the money that a bail bondsman makes, and sorry, did we lose Tom? Oh, no, he's okay. Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
my screen
He
shifted.
should still be there.
Okay,
I'm still here.
Sorry, I was like, oh no. I don't think it's a direct correlated budget item. So it's primarily the bail bondsmen are the primary beneficiaries of that commercialized industry. However, there is a connection, and it's a really good question, because if we have more people in our jail, so less people who are able to afford their bail amounts or even utilize a bail bondsman, the city actually spends more money on incarcerating them. And so we would make the argument that cities should actually support, reforming our bail system that facilitates fewer people being detained, because if you have fewer people detained, then you're spending fewer money to incarcerate them pre-trial in the first place. And so we can be thinking about just doing an analysis of the jail. Let's say we have 1,000 people in our jail, and 400 of them are charged with non-crimes of violence. So simple possession of drugs, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, whatever it might be. Just release those people, give them subpoenas, and show up to court. And if you can reduce, so a lot of jails will have a pod system or a tier system. So let's say a pod holds 60 people, and it costs $1 million to operate that pod. If you can shut down a pod because you have 60 fewer people in your jail, then you're saving them $1 million. And so there is a correlation between people's ability to pay their bail and the amount of money a city is spending on running the jail. Although the money doesn't transfer from a bail bondsman to the city, there is that connection. However, there's always exceptions to the rule. In Louisiana, we no longer have it because of a lawsuit. When you would pay, when you utilize a commercial bail bondsman, there was a 4%, what they call a bail fee. 1.8% of the bail fee went back to the court. 0.4% went to the DA, 0.4% went to the public defender, 0.4% went to the sheriff. And so there was that financial connection, but it's clearly a financial conflict of interest for judges, right? They cannot be the determiners of the size of the pie, knowing that they're going to get a slice of that pie. And so Vera's data actually helped reveal this conflict of interest. We shared the data with some of our litigation partners, and they filed a lawsuit and ultimately won. And so now that kind of kickback doesn't go to the court. But I'm trying to make the point that a city creating a budget for their criminal legal system could base it off of, well, over the past 5 years, the court system has earned $5 million in bail fees. So we know that's $5 million we don't have to provide from our own coffers. But thankfully, the lawsuit kind of discontinued that practice.
Thank you for that information.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Thank you.
And let me just pull the report that lays all that out, just so you have it. What was that report? It was called Paid in Full. No, not paid in full. Past due. Sorry.
Well, Will looks that up. Any other questions? I think we've got time for one, maybe two more. Any other questions while Will's with us today?
I've got a question. First of all, sorry for joining late. I'm on the West Coast and got the time zone thing. Along the lines of follow the money kind of thing, I was listening to something, and I don't know if it was local here, just in California, or it was a national report about the way prisoners were being charged for like cell phones and internet access, and how that just created this additional burden both on the incarcerated and then their families. And just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So
and it was just it was so distressing to hear, because it was such a simple thing of keeping, and there was like evidence that it, keeping people connected with their families helps when they're released again.
100%.
And yet the cost of that was so ridiculous, more than like what we're paying, and for like full access to everything.
Yeah. The primary, or one of the most popular companies that provides the service of phone calls between incarcerated people at a jail or a prison and their families is called Securus. And Securus, when you use a Securus line, it's limited to a 15-minute phone call. The line is recorded, so every 2 minutes you get an interruption reminding you that it's recorded. And you have to have money on your, money on your books to be able to use Securus. So if I have a loved one that's incarcerated, I have to set up a Securus account for them to be able to call me, because I'll be paying it. So it's not necessarily the incarcerated person that's paying it, but it's the family member on the outside that's paying it. And it's problematic. And to your point, there's a handful of studies that demonstrate maintaining those family connections actually supports a person's ability to kind of reintegrate back into our communities when their sentence is complete. So then the question becomes like, why are we using this opportunity to make money off of people when we know there's actually a benefit to facilitating this communication? So what ends up happening is people do have cell phones in prison, but cell phones, as far as I know, are considered contraband. But people are using cell phones to communicate with their loved ones because they don't have to pay as much for the Securus fee. But then what ends up happening is if you get caught with a cell phone, then you get time added to your sentence, or you get perhaps sent to solitary confinement or some type of punishment because of you just wanting to communicate with your family. And the last thing that I really don't like, at least as it relates to jails and sometimes prisons, is that the calls are recorded. And sometimes those calls are used to as part of evidence in a case. And I really got upset when I heard a phone call between myself and my client, which under normal circumstances is attorney-client privilege, and they were trying to use that as evidence in the case based on what we were talking about. So it would be great, and there actually might be a company, if it hasn't already existed, it's a good idea, of creating an alternative service provider that essentially provides free phone calls between incarcerated people and their families to really eliminate the market hold that Securus has on the industry. The only problem with that is that the prisons get a kickback of the Securus funds as well, right? So like when a prison secures that contract with Securus, they'll get a percentage of whatever the user fee is going to be. So then if you're trying to disrupt that system, you have to figure out how do you get those agreements with those different prisons, because you're taking away money from them and they're not going to be too excited about that.
There's so much we've uncovered in this conversation, Will, that I think are avenues for further research and exploration for all of this, both in terms of problems, but also creative solutions or alternative proposals people out there are working on to address these. So I encourage everyone, if there's anything that stuck out from what Will was saying today, to go and read the Vera reports or do some independent looking to see what organizations are out there doing this work. But Will, before we end, I want to say any last words, any final thoughts you want to leave us with coming out of this conversation today?
Continue your quest to learn about our criminal legal system and other systems that you all might be exploring during your conversations. You know, when we know more about how these systems are working, we can be part of conversations that can reveal solutions. And we inherited this criminal legal system. None of us were part of designing it. And one of the things that I love about democracy is that we have opportunities to kind of change what our systems look like. Now, obviously, it can take a very long time, just in terms of representing somebody, or excuse me, electing somebody in the various different positions of government. But I think we are in a unique moment in our country, both on the heels of George Floyd being killed, amongst many other people being killed in 2020 and the years before and after, as well as this moment of increase in violent crime, where people are thirsty for a better system, right? A system that prevents incidents like George Floyd being killed and incidents that we're experiencing right now with an increase in violent crime. And I think if we can recognize those two flashpoints as an opportunity to revisit how we are promoting public safety and how we are promoting justice, that we can actually redesign a new system. Now, there are conversations that people have had about the concept of abolition, which is frequently like framed as just burn everything to the ground and start anew. And that's not actually what abolition, from my perspective, has represented. It is really kind of a piecemeal transition to a new way. And we think we can start with identifying the individual pieces of our criminal legal systems and how could they look differently. So right now we have the institution of policing. There are productive things that the police are able to do, and there are not so productive things that police are able to do. How do we change what policing looks like? We have sentencing structures in our criminal legal system. How can we change what that looks like in terms of ideas like mandatory minimums or 3X laws, or the power of prosecution? How do we change that? And so really, I think sometimes that gets mislabeled with the conversation of abolition is kind of shut everything down today. And so then what do we have tomorrow? And when I don't consider myself an abolitionist, but when I've spoken with abolitionists, they have shared with me a much longer kind of timeline of getting rid of the bad things that aren't working and replacing them with things that actually would work, that aren't necessarily rooted in punishment, and viewing people as risks and instead viewing people as people with needs and meeting those needs appropriately. So I just say kind of continue your learning, continue your conversations, disagree with even things that I've shared with you all today, lean into that disagreement. And I think with a quest to kind of create what I say like a justice system worthy of its name, we can actually improve safety and justice in our country.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Will. You've given us so much to chew on. We really appreciate your time, taking it away from what you do right in communities and doing this work more broadly to come and spend an hour with us teaching us about all of this. I always come back to what one of our Palestinian partners says, which is hope is what you do. So let's go out there and keep doing this individually and together. And we'll see you all again shortly. So thanks so much, Will, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.